December 7, 1941. A calm Sunday morning blanketed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The sky was clear. The sea was still. Sailors were just waking, reading letters from home, polishing boots, and preparing for another quiet day in paradise. But paradise was about to become a nightmare. At 7:48 a.m., without warning, the sky erupted in fire. From the north, over the still waters of the Pacific, came the unmistakable drone of aircraft. Nearly 200 Japanese bombers, torpedo planners and fighters diving from the clouds in perfect formation. They came not in waves, but in fury. Within minutes, torpedoes slammed into the sides of US battleships docked neatly in the harbor. Bombs rained down from above, igniting fuel tanks, tearing through decks, and shattering steel. The USS Arizona, pride of the Pacific Fleet, was split open by a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb. In an instant, more than 1,100 men aboard were incinerated. Flames engulfed the harbor. Oil-slicked waters burned black. Men jumped overboard into fire. Others suffocated below deck, trapped by twisted metal and collapsing hulls. Pearl Harbor was under full-scale attack. It was a masterstroke of planning and a failure of imagination. The Japanese Empire, facing years of growing U.S. sanctions over its brutal expansion into China and Southeast Asia, had decided on war. But they knew a drawn-out conflict with the United States was suicide. Their only hope was a decisive, crippling blow, a knockout punch that would break America's will before it could rise. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, had studied in America. He knew its industrial power. He knew its spirit. And privately, he feared he had awakened a giant. But in Tokyo, the war drums drowned out. The attack had been timed to perfection while U.S. diplomats were still engaged in negotiations with Japan and Washington. It was, by all international norms, a sneak attack, a betrayal. By the time the smoke cleared just after 9 a.m., over 2,400 Americans lay dead. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, and over 300 aircraft were wrecked on the ground. The Pacific Fleet had been stunned, bloodied but not broken. In the words of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, delivered to Congress the next day, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. With those words, America entered the war. But not just with Japan. Within 4 days, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy declared war on the United States. The Second World War was now global fully and undeniably. The dominoes fell fast. In Southeast Asia, Japanese forces launched simultaneous offensives. British held Hong Kong fell. The Philippines came under brutal siege. In the weeks to come, Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress, would collapse under the rising sun of Japan. The Allied world was stunned. For over 2 years, Britain had stood alone against Hitler's onslaught in Europe. Now, with America in the war, hope returned, but so did chaos. In Europe, Hitler welcomed the chance to fight America, believing that U-boats would choke its supplies before its industry could awaken. He was wrong. Across his factories, war production exploded overnight. Millions in aircraft carriers, tanks, bombers, and rifles rolled off assembly lines. The arsenal of democracy had ignited. But victory would not come quickly. In the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, commanding U.S. forces in the Philippines, faced overwhelming odds. Despite heroic resistance at Bataan and Korea, his troops would eventually surrender, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino soldiers perished under Japanese brutality. Antony Beevor writes that this period from December 1941 into early 1942 was the darkest hour for the Allies since Dunkirk. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. Hitler was still deep inside Soviet territory, and the United States, despite its strength, was reeling. But beneath the chaos, the shape of global resistance was forming. For the first time, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union found themselves aligned against the Axis powers. 3 very different nations, with very different visions. now fought for a shared survival. World War II was no longer just about Europe. It was everywhere, on the beaches of the Philippines, in the jungles of Burma, in the skies over the Atlantic, and soon, in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Pearl Harbor was not just a military disaster. It was the spark that turned a regional war into a global inferno. The world would never be the same again. January 1942. The world held its breath as Japan's war machine surged across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Pearl Harbor had been the spark, but now came the firestorm. One by one, colonial outposts, military bases, and entire nations fell before the rising sun. In less than 3 months, Japan seized more territory than Nazi Germany had in 3 years. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Burma, and Singapore all fell like dominoes. No one had expected such a coordinated onslaught. In Singapore, Britain's fortress in the east, over 80,000 Allied troops surrendered. On February 15th was the largest capitulation in British history. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. British troops trained to defend against land attacks watched in horror as Japanese tanks rolled in from the Malayan jungle, not from the sea. Antony Beevor wrote, "It was not just a military failure, it was a psychological shock. The British Empire was supposed to be invincible, and yet here it had been humiliated." Meanwhile, in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's forces were retreating into the Bataan Peninsula, fighting back against a far superior Japanese force. American and Filipino soldiers held out heroically for months, but the fall was inevitable. In April, Bataan surrendered. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced into the brutal Bataan Death March, a 65-mile trek through searing heat, starvation, and beatings. Nearly 10,000 perished along the way. Japan's goal wasn't just military dominance, it was psychological domination, shock, terror. And for a while, it worked. But in Berlin, another gamble was being made. On December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler made one of the most disastrous decisions of his life. He declared war on the United States. He was under no obligation to do so. The tripartite pact with Japan did not require it, as Japan had initiated the conflict. He also believed that by aligning fully with Japan, he could divide American attention and resources. It was, Beevor notes, an extraordinary act of strategic blindness, because now the United States was fully engaged in both the Pacific and European theaters. With its vast industrial capacity and limitless manpower, America was about to become the decisive force in the war, and Hitler had brought that storm upon himself. Back on the Eastern Front, Hitler's forces had reached the very outskirts of Moscow in late 1941. The German army had advanced further and faster than any force in history. But it had overreached. Winter had come, brutal, punishing, and unrelenting. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper, praying not to lose toes. The Wehrmacht was not prepared for this. Soviet reinforcements, drawn from Siberia, after assurances that Japan would not attack from the east. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were pushed back. It was a turning point. It was a pattern that would grow whenever failure came. Blame was assigned elsewhere, and as the Eastern Front bogged down in snow and blood, and the Pacific burned, something else was changing. The war was no longer just about territory. It was about ideology, about extermination, about annihilation. The Holocaust was accelerating. In January 1942, at a secluded villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials gathered. Their goal was chillingly simple: to coordinate the final solution to the Jewish question. It was here that the systematic, industrialized extermination of Europe's Jews was formalized. Ghettos would be emptied. Trains would run day and night. Death camps like Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Treblinka would become operational centers of murder. The war was no longer just soldiers against soldiers. Civilians, entire populations, were now targets. A new kind of war had begun, one that measured victories not in land, but in lives destroyed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was mobilizing at an unprecedented pace. Factories converted overnight. Car plants began building tanks. Washing machine companies built bomb casings. By 1942, America was producing 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and over 20,000 anti-aircraft guns. It was not just war, it was mass production on a biblical scale. Men enlisted by the millions. Women entered the workforce in droves, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. For the first time, the war effort reached into every home, every factory, every farm. President Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, and it was now fully armed. Across Britain, the mood shifted. Once alone and battered, now bolstered by a powerful ally, Churchill declared, "Now we are masters of our fate again." But the road ahead was still long and brutal. In North Africa, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was wreaking havoc across Libya and Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal. In the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled the seas, sinking Allied convoys with ruthless efficiency. And in Asia, Japanese forces still advanced, planning further strikes into India and Australia. The world was not just at war. The world was on fire. From the snows of Russia to the sands of Egypt, from the jungles of Burma to the factories of Detroit, every nation, every person, every corner of the earth was now touched by the flames of conflict. Antony Beevor called this phase of the war, the moment when the global fuse burned fastest. The coming years would bring unimaginable destruction, but they would also bring resistance, unity, and eventually, by mid-1942, the world was bleeding. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, had stretched their dominion across continents. But with each conquest, their grip began to slip. Their empires, built in fury, were beginning to crack. In Europe, resistance movements began to grow from the ashes. In France, the Free French under General Charles de Gaulle coordinated with underground cells known as the Maquis, and students who sabotaged rail lines, assassinated German officers, and relayed intelligence to London. In Poland, despite unthinkable repression, partisan units staged raids, destroyed German convoys, and helped smuggle Jews out of ghettos. In Norway, resistance fighters blew up heavy water plants crippling Nazi atomic research. In the East, Soviet partisans waged a shadow war behind enemy lines, planting mines, ambushing supply lines, and haunting the flanks of the German advance. The Axis had overextended itself territorially, militarily, and morally, and the Allies were beginning to organize. Antony Beevor writes, "The illusion of Axis invincibility shattered not in grand battles but in the defiance of ordinary people." Even in Germany, murmurs of doubt were growing. The swift victories of 1939 and 1940 were gone. Now came death, shortages, and fear. And in the Pacific, that illusion was about to be obliterated. June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy, vastly outnumbered, faced down the Imperial Japanese Navy near a small atoll in the Central Pacific. The Japanese plan was bold: lure the American carriers into a trap and destroy them, paving the way for dominance across the Pacific. But American codebreakers had cracked parts of the Japanese plan, and Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared an ambush of his own. The battle raged for hours in the skies above the sea. Torpedo bombers were slaughtered. Pilots flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire. But then, in a window of pure luck and sheer bravery, American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers vulnerable, loaded with aircraft and fuel on deck. In minutes, for Japanese carriers Akagi, once dominant, was crippled in a single afternoon. Midway was not just a military victory, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, the rising sun had stumbled. Japan would never fully recover the initiative again. Back in Europe, another campaign was reaching a boiling point. North Africa, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, brilliant, bold, and charismatic, was pushing deep into Egypt. His Africa Corps outmaneuvered British forces repeatedly, capturing Tobruk and threatening the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for the British Empire. But at El Alamein, the tide began to turn. British General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed and meticulous in preparation, amassed troops, tanks, and artillery. In October 1942, the Allies launched a crushing. Rommel fought back ferociously, but he was outgunned, outnumbered, and out of fuel. After 2 weeks of brutal combat, the Germans Churchill, relieved and triumphant, declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was a turning point, a beacon, a sign that the Axis could be beaten and would be. Meanwhile, in the United States, war production was reaching levels never seen in human history. Antony Beevor details how, in 1942 alone, America produced over 48,000 military aircraft. In the time it took the Nazis to build one tank, the U.S. could produce 10. Liberty ships, cargo vessels essential to transatlantic supply, were being constructed in under 2 weeks. Some were built in 4 days. The scale was staggering, and it wasn't just numbers, it was innovation: radar, sonar, long-range bombers, portable bridges, new amphibious landing crafts. American and British scientists worked day and night, alongside soldiers and civilians, pushing the boundaries of wartime engineering. But while the front lines blazed, the shadows deepened. In Nazi-occupied Europe, the Holocaust was escalating. Ghettos were being liquidated. Entire communities disappeared overnight. Trains rolled toward Auschwitz. The world still did not fully comprehend the scale of the extermination, but whispers were growing louder. Resistance networks smuggled out reports. Survivors who escaped told their stories. The Allied leadership, preoccupied with the military front, began to hear the unimaginable. Beevor notes. Asterisk for many. The horror was still too vast to believe. A civilization built on rationality had birthed factories of death. By the end of 1942, the war had truly globalized. Allied forces were now engaging in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe. Millions fought under different flags but for the same cause: survival. Germany was still deep inside Soviet territory, but its advance was stalling. Japan still held vast islands, but its fleet was reeling. And though the path to victory remained distant, one truth had emerged. The Axis was no longer unstoppable. The resistance was rising. The Allies were coordinating, and the seeds of Hitler's downfall had been sown. The next chapter would be written not just in military strategy but in the blood of cities soon to become legends: Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy, Berlin. But that was still to come. Late 1942. Across the world, fault lines were forming inside the Axis war machine. What had once looked like a seamless, unstoppable campaign was now being chipped away from the Pacific Islands to the deserts of North Africa and deep in the snows of the Soviet Union. And something bigger was taking shape, something Axis feared most: unity. On January 1st, 1942, a landmark moment took place in Washington, D.C. Representatives of 26 nations, including the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, India, and France, signed the Declaration by United Nations. For the first time, a global coalition was formalized, pledging to defeat the Axis powers and uphold the principles of freedom, justice, and peace. Though far from the former United Nations we know today, this declaration was historic. Beevor notes. Asterisk. This was not merely a military alliance, it was a moral one. A war for survival, yes, but also for civilization itself. Each signatory nation agreed to pool military resources, coordinate strategy, and share intelligence. A war once divided by oceans, politics, and ideology was now coordinated under a single, burning goal. But global unity didn't mean global victory. In the Atlantic, German U-boats steadily and silently continued to sink Allied convoys at an alarming rate. Merchant mariners, lived with the constant fear of torpedoes striking in the dead of night. Entire ships vanished without a trace. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought in trenches, but in darkness fueled by sonar, stealth, and survival. Yet Allied advances in radar and encryption began to turn the tide. British code breakers at Bletchley Park, led by pioneers like Alan Turing, were cracking German Enigma transmissions faster than ever before. Convoy routes were adjusted. Submarines were hunted. By the end of 1942, the wolf packs were bleeding. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the second major front was opening. In November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, a massive amphibious landing in Morocco and Algeria. American and British forces landed simultaneously on multiple beaches, confronting both German and Vichy French resistance. It marked the first time American troops engaged in large-scale combat in the European theater. They were green, untested but determined. Rommels Africa Corps, caught between Montgomery's forces in the east and the new Anglo-American armies in the west, began a long retreat through Tunisia. The Desert War was reaching its end. Hitler's southern flank was crumbling. But while Europe burned, the Pacific boiled. In early 1943, the brutal Guadalcanal campaign was grinding toward conclusion. The fighting there, in the jungles and swamps of the Solomon Islands, was unlike anything seen in Europe. Disease, starvation, and close quarters combat defined the battle. Japanese troops refused to surrender. They fought to the death. For U.S. Marines, it was a baptism by fire. Guadalcanal would become a symbol of resilience, of turning tides, and of the unforgiving nature of Pacific warfare. Back in Europe, a different kind of war was taking shape. The air war. British and American bombers were taking the war to German skies. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin came under intense aerial assault. The RF's night raids and the USAAF's daylight bombing campaigns devastated industrial centers but also civilian populations. Antony Beevor addresses this moral complexity with honesty. Greater than asterisk bombing campaigns brought the war home to Germany, but they also blurred the line between military necessity and civilian costs. While many saw it as retribution for the Blitz and a necessary blow to Nazi production, others questioned the ethics of total destruction. Yet there was no doubt Germany was feeling the pressure by land, sea, and air. Inside Hitler's inner circle, paranoia and delusion grew. He refused to listen to his generals. He micromanaged from bunkers, issuing orders disconnected from battlefield realities. His decision to hold positions at all costs led to unnecessary massacres of his own troops. Flexibility, a cornerstone of military success, was forbidden under his absolute rule. Meanwhile, the Red Army was preparing to launch the counteroffensive of a generation. The German advance into the Soviet Union, once lightning fast, had become a brutal crawl. Winter was no longer a surprise. Soviet industry, moved deep into the Urals, was now outproducing the Germans. Entire factories had been reassembled by hand, working around the clock. 1 million rifles, tens of thousands of tanks, and Stalin, though ruthless, had learned from his early failures. The Red Army was reorganizing, rebuilding, and regaining confidence. At Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in human history was about to begin, but that belonged to the next chapter. For now, as 1942 came to a close, the world had changed. The Axis had lost its momentum. The Allies had found their footing. Global alliances had solidified. Industry was at full steam. New strategies were forming. Resistance movements were expanding. The skies, the seas, and the ground itself were shifting. The war was still far from over, but its shape had changed. No longer was it a series of regional conflicts. It was a singular, all-consuming war. A war where cities became battlefields, where ideologies drove extermination, where civilians suffered as much as soldiers. Antony Beevor called the year's end a pivot in the great storm, because from this point forward, the war would enter a new, even more brutal phase. And in the distance, from the snows of Russia to the waters of Normandy, the faint outline of Axis defeat began to form. The fire had spread, but so had resistance, and soon the world would fight, not just to survive but to win.